A colony can be at its biological peak and still miss the main nectar flow entirely. Not because the bees failed, not because the beekeeper was careless, but because a 21-day development cycle quietly shifted the forager population out of alignment with the only weeks that matter for annual honey storage. Have you seen this in your own colonies? Strong spring buildup, good brood pattern, healthy numbers, and then a honey crop that doesn't reflect any of it? If that gap has happened in your apiary, this video will explain exactly why. And if you haven't experienced it yet, understanding this mechanism before it occurs is the difference between a productive season and an avoidable loss. Like this video, if the biology of colony timing is what you're here for, it helps this channel reach beekeepers who want precision over speculation. The mechanism is not complicated, but it operates silently. A newly laid egg requires 21 days to develop into an adult worker bee. That worker will then spend the first 10 to 12 days of her life inside the hive, performing nursing, wax production, and comb building before she transitions to foraging. This means that from the moment an egg is laid, approximately 33 to 35 days pass before that individual bee contributes to nectar collection. This is not a variable. It is fixed biology. The problem arises because nectar flows are not fixed. They are determined by regional climate, elevation, and the phenology of dominant forage plants. In most temperate beekeeping regions, the primary nectar flow window lasts between 3 and 6 weeks. Some regions compress that window further, to 18 or 21 days. In those situations, the margin for brood cycle misalignment is essentially zero. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: the forager population that collects honey during the main flow was not born during the flow. She was born 5 weeks before it. The queen's laying decisions in late winter and early spring, decisions influenced by temperature, pollen availability, and colony population, determine who is alive and foraging when the nectar becomes available. The mistake, in other words, doesn't happen during the flow. It happened weeks earlier. To understand why this matters across an entire season, it is necessary to build the biological timeline from the beginning of the brood year. In late winter, when ambient temperatures are still too low for consistent foraging, the queen begins to expand her laying rate in response to two primary stimuli: increasing day length and the availability of stored pollen. In temperate northern hemisphere apiaries, this typically occurs between late January and early March, depending on latitude and microclimate. In southern hemisphere operations, the equivalent window falls between July and September. At this stage, the colony is operating on a brood-to-nurse bee ratio that is carefully balanced by the bees themselves. The colony will not allow the queen to lay more brood than the nurse bee population can adequately cover in warm. Brood that cannot be maintained at 34 to 35 degrees Celsius, 93 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, will be chilled, and chilled brood dies. Chilled brood also disrupts the internal immune regulation of the cluster and creates entry points for opportunistic pathogens. This means that early spring brood expansion is self-regulating. The bees will manage it. The question for the beekeeper is whether that self-regulation is sufficient to build the forager population that the incoming nectar flow will require, or whether intervention is warranted. Early beekeepers working in the period between roughly 1910 and 1940 understood this relationship empirically. Before the developmental biology of Apis mellifera had been formally quantified, field practitioners working with Langstroth equipment in regions with well-defined single-flow seasons, white clover, basswood, tulip poplar, or orchard blossom, depending on geography, recognized that colonies which expanded brood rearing too late in spring consistently underperformed during the main flow. Their solution was not chemical or synthetic stimulation. It was strategic management of the brood nest's thermal environment and pollen availability to coax earlier and more sustained brood rearing in colonies that were biologically capable of supporting it. The mechanism they were acting on, though they described it in practical rather than biological terms, was the 21-day lag. More bees, less honey. That paradox confused early beekeepers in the same way it confuses contemporary practitioners. The colony can be visually impressive: dense coverage on every frame, tight brood pattern, bees clustered across 8 to 10 frames, and still produce a poor honey crop if the age distribution of those bees is wrong for the timing of the flow. The age distribution problem works in two directions. If brood rearing accelerates too early, the resulting forager population peaks before the nectar flow begins. Those foragers age rapidly in the field. Forager lifespan under active foraging conditions is approximately 15 to 40 days depending on foraging intensity, distance traveled, and weather conditions. A forager produced in a premature early spring brood surge may be physiologically depleted before the main flow even opens. Conversely, if brood rearing is delayed, suppressed by cold weather, poor pollen availability, or an aging queen with a reduced laying rate, the forager population will still be ramping up when the nectar flow reaches its peak or even begins to close. A colony in that situation enters the flow in expansion mode, with a large proportion of its labor force still committed to brood care rather than foraging. Growth without timing is loss. This is not a statement about beekeeper error. It is a statement about the biological consequence of calendar misalignment. The colony is doing exactly what it should do. The brood is being raised. The population is growing. But if the timing of that growth does not produce a forager peak that coincides with the nectar availability window, the honey storage outcome will reflect that misalignment regardless of the colony's overall health. To apply this understanding practically, a beekeeper must first establish a reliable local phenology baseline. This means tracking, across multiple seasons, the first consistent bloom of early spring pollen sources, willow, alder, hazel, maple, depending on region, and back-calculating from the date of the main nectar flow to identify when the queen must be laying at maximum rate for that laying effort to produce foragers that are active during the flow. The calculation is straightforward. If the main nectar flow in a given region opens on, for example, the 20th of May, a beekeeper must count backward 33 to 35 days to identify the target maximum laying window. That places peak brood rearing at approximately the 15th to 17th of April. The queen should be laying at or near her maximum capacity during that window to produce the forager cohort that will work the main flow. If inspection in early April reveals that the colony is still on 4 to 5 frames of brood with limited expansion, the beekeeper has a narrow window to make a meaningful intervention. That window closes quickly. The inspection sequence for managing this biological pressure requires consistent monitoring from late winter through early flow onset. Recommended inspection intervals during this period are every 7 to 10 days, once ambient daytime temperatures reach 14 degrees Celsius, approximately 57 degrees Fahrenheit, consistently enough to allow hive opening without damaging the brood nest. At each inspection, the beekeeper is assessing 3 primary indicators: frame coverage by bees, the number of frames containing actively developing brood, and the pattern density of capped worker brood. A colony approaching optimal spring population should show solid, dense capped brood across 6 to 8 frames, with bees covering at minimum 8 to 10 frames total. Brood pattern should show minimal missed cells, ideally fewer than 1 missed cell per 20 to 30 capped cells across the brood nest. Any significant spotting in a capped brood pattern at this stage warrants closer examination, as spotty brood can indicate a failing queen, Varroa-associated developmental disruption, or European foul brood pressure, all of which compound the timing problem. A colony showing only 4 to 5 frames of brood in early to mid-April, in a region with a late May main flow, is behind schedule. It is not lost, but intervention at this point is time-sensitive. The interventions available to a beekeeper at this stage depend on the specific nature of the delay and the resources available. If the limiting factor is pollen availability, which is common in early springs following cold, dry winters with poor pollen storage, pollen supplementation using high-quality pollen substitute patties placed directly on the top bars of the brood frames can support nurse bee nutrition and allow the colony to safely cover and develop more brood. The thermal requirements do not change. The colony can only rear as much brood as it can maintain at 34 to 35 degrees Celsius. But adequate protein nutrition removes one constraint on brood rearing expansion. If the limiting factor is thermal capacity, a small winter cluster that has not yet expanded sufficiently, artificially concentrating the colony by reducing the internal volume to match the current bee population is a more appropriate response. removing drawn comb that is not being used, and allowing the cluster to consolidate on a smaller number of frames improves thermal efficiency and allows the queen to expand laying into previously cold or underutilized areas of the brood nest as the cluster grows. If the limiting factor is a reduced performance queen, an aging queen from a previous season with declining pheromone output and reduced egg-laying rate, colony requeening, or combining with a stronger nucleus colony, may be the only intervention that restores the timing alignment before it is too late. The mistake happened weeks earlier. In the case of a poor queen, that mistake often traces back to the previous summer or autumn, when a declining queen should have been replaced and was not. The mid-season risk escalation follows a predictable progression that experienced beekeepers recognize as a warning pattern. The first signal is late brood nest consolidation. A colony that reaches late April with a brood nest that has not expanded beyond 6 frames has already lost significant forager production opportunity. The workers that will not exist in late May are determined by this failure. The second signal is premature forager aging. In colonies where brood rearing has stalled or been suppressed, the existing forager cohort, workers that should still be acting as nurse bees, is pressed into early foraging service to compensate. This is called precocious foraging. It resolves the immediate colony need, but draws down the nurse bee population, which in turn limits the brood nest's ability to expand, which compounds the delay. The third signal is swarm pressure in the presence of limited storage space. This is a critical and often overlooked interaction. A colony that is building strongly in late spring, healthy, well-fed, with a productive queen, will rapidly fill available brood nest space and begin producing queen cells as a swarm response if the beekeeper has not provided adequate space for both brood and incoming nectar at the right moment. Swarm pressure does not wait for the nectar flow to begin. It develops 2 to 3 weeks before the flow, precisely when the pre-flow forager cohort is being built. If a colony swarms in the 3 to 4 weeks before the main nectar flow opens, the biological impact is severe. The colony loses approximately 50 to 60% of its forager population in the swarm event. The remaining colony must then rear a new queen, a process requiring 16 days from queen cell to adult queen, followed by 5 to 7 days to mating flights, followed by 3 to 5 days before laying begins. Under ideal conditions, that new queen is laying by roughly 4 weeks after swarming. The resulting workers from her first brood will not be foragers for another 33 to 35 days. In a region with a main nectar flow that opens in late May and closes in late June, a 4 to 5 week window, a swarm event in early May is catastrophically mistimed. The colony will not rebuild a functional forager population until mid-July at the earliest. The main flow is entirely missed. This is not an edge case. It is one of the most common reasons strong spring colonies produce weak honey crops. The intervention is straightforward. Super addition ahead of swarm pressure, not in response to it. A colony showing 7 or more frames of brood in late April or early May should have a super in place, ideally drawn comb before the nectar flow begins. The super serves a dual function. It provides storage space that reduces the perceived congestion in the brood nest, and it gives the forager population a destination for incoming nectar that does not compete with the brood area. Super placement timing is one of the most consequential decisions of the spring season, and it is one that is routinely made too late. Beekeepers, who wait for the first visible signs of nectar flow, nectar bearding, bees clustering at the entrance in unusually large numbers, or the detection of fresh nectar in open cells during inspection, before adding supers, have already lost forager storage momentum. A forager that returns to a hive where every available cell is occupied with brood, pollen, or nectar will begin to reduce her foraging activity. This is not laziness. It is a feedback mechanism in which the colony's storage capacity acts as a regulator on foraging behavior. The physiological signal is mediated through trophallaxis, food sharing behavior among workers, and through the colony's pheromone environment. When nectar-receiving bees are occupied beyond capacity and cannot accept incoming loads promptly, foragers receive a chemical and behavioral signal that reduces their foraging frequency. Foraging suppression during peak nectar availability is among the most expensive mistakes a beekeeper can make in terms of seasonal income potential. In a colony capable of collecting 40 to 60 kilograms of surplus honey during a well-aligned flow, foraging suppression can reduce that figure by 20 to 35%. For a small-scale producer managing 10 to 20 colonies and dependent on a single regional flow for the majority of annual honey income, that reduction is not abstract. A short flowering window, 3 to 4 weeks of productive nectar availability, compresses the entire income event of the season into a period where every week of misalignment carries a direct financial cost. Beekeepers managing on thin margins cannot absorb the loss of even one of those weeks. Late-season consequences of the brood shift are less dramatic, but equally significant from a colony continuity standpoint. A colony that missed the main flow due to forager population misalignment may attempt to compensate through increased foraging activity during minor late summer flows. Goldenrod, late clover, autumn aster, depending on region. These flows are generally less productive per unit time than the primary spring flow, but they contribute to winter stores and help rebuild the colony's food reserve. However, a colony that was allowed to swarm and then rebuild forager population through the main flow season enters late summer with a younger queen and a smaller stored food reserve than a well-managed non-swarm colony. Late-season varroa mite load compounds this problem. The new queen's first brood provides a dense, uniform development environment that accelerates mite reproduction at exactly the time when colony population is recovering. Without intervention in late July or August, mite treatment, late-season feeding if stores are inadequate, and assessment of the new queen's laying pattern, the colony enters autumn in a compromised state. The bees that will carry the colony through winter are being raised in conditions of nutritional stress and elevated mite pressure. Winter mortality risk in this scenario is meaningfully higher than in a colony that retained its forager population through the main flow and entered late summer with strong stores and a settled queen. The relationship between brood timing and honey storage has been understood, in practical terms, for well over a century. Beekeepers operating in the early 20th century, working with Langstroth equipment without synthetic miticides, without artificial insemination programs, without the precision weather data now available, still managed to produce consistent crops from single-flow regions by synchronizing their management calendar to the colony's own developmental biology. Their records, many preserved in beekeeping journals from the period 1900 to 1940, show a consistent pattern. The most productive beekeepers were not those who intervened most aggressively, but those who intervened at the right moment and then trusted the colony to execute. They added supers before they were needed. They replaced queens before the laying rate declined visibly. They checked brood frame counts in early spring with the same regularity that a grain farmer checks soil temperature before planting. The biological mechanism they were managing is unchanged. The 21-day development cycle has not been modified by decades of selective breeding. The relationship between brood timing and forager population is as fixed now as it was in 1920. What has changed is the climate context in which that biology operates. Earlier spring warm periods followed by cold snaps create thermal stress events that disrupt brood rearing continuity. Earlier bloom timing in some regions has compressed the gap between the onset of forager building season and the opening of the nectar flow. In other regions, drought conditions have shortened nectar flow duration significantly. The margin for error in the brood-to-bloom alignment is, in many cases, narrower now than it was in the era when the fundamental management principles were established. The beekeeper who understands the 21-day lag is not working with a historical curiosity. That beekeeper is working with the most relevant biological variable available for managing production under modern seasonal conditions. The correction is not complex, but it requires calendar discipline. Establish the date of the main nectar flow in your region with as much precision as possible. Use your own multi-year records if available. Supplement with local agricultural extension data, historical bloom records, or communication with other beekeepers in your specific region. Count backward 33 to 35 days from the flow opening date. That is your target peak laying window. Begin monitoring colony brood frame count. Every 7 to 10 days, starting 6 to 8 weeks before the flow. Intervene to support brood rearing through pollen supplementation, thermal management, or requeening if the colony is running 3 or more weeks behind a biologically appropriate expansion curve. Place supers ahead of the flow, not at its onset. For a colony covering 8 or more frames of bees with 6 or more frames of active brood in the final 2 weeks before the flow, at least one super of drawn comb should already be in place. Monitor for swarm cell production every 7 days during the 3 to 4 weeks preceding the flow. Remove swarm cells only as part of a coherent swarm management strategy. Splitting, nucleus creation, or controlled queen replacement. Not as an isolated intervention that delays swarming without addressing the underlying impulse. The result of this approach is not transformation. It is synchronization. A colony managed with attention to the 21-day brood cycle will not necessarily produce more bees than a colony managed without that attention. What it will produce is a forager population that is maximally active during the weeks that matter. Honey storage improves not because the bees worked harder, but because the bees were present in sufficient numbers, at the right developmental stage, at the moment when the nectar was available. That synchronization stabilizes production across seasons. It reduces the variability that makes small-scale beekeeping economically unpredictable. It restores foraging balance to colonies that would otherwise expend peak season energy on late brood rearing rather than nectar collection. It prevents the predictable collapse of a colony's honey crop that follows a missed swarm event or a late super addition. The 21-day shift does not announce itself. It does not produce obvious symptoms at the moment it occurs. Its consequences appear weeks later, when the colony is strong, the bees are active, and the supers remain light. By then, the intervention window has closed. The bees haven't changed. The climate applies pressure. Timing decides. Biology leads. The beekeeper adjusts, or the season records the result.